I can't believe I even have to say this sentence out loud in the year we are currently living in. But the removal clock for Donald Trump is now openly ticking. Not behind the scenes, not in hypotheticals. Out in the open, on camera, with sitting members of Congress publicly calling for the President of the United States to resign or be forcibly removed from office. Again. And if you're watching this and feeling like you're taking crazy pills, like, didn't we already do this? Didn't we already live through the impeachment, the insurrection, the constitutional freefall? You are not alone. Because this isn't normal. This isn't politics as usual. This is a 5-alarm constitutional emergency unfolding in real time. Let's be extremely clear about what's happening here. This isn't Democrats making noise. This isn't cable news hysteria. More than 100 lawmakers are now on the record demanding Trump step down or be removed using every tool in the Constitution. Impeachment, the 25th Amendment, the nuclear options. They're not whispering it, they're saying it into microphones with their names attached. That alone should stop you cold. And what is Trump's response to all of this? Denial, rage, victimhood. The same playbook every single time. He acts like the entire country is attacking him for no reason, after spending years daring the system to stop him. This isn't politics. This is gaslighting on an industrial scale. Because think about how insane this moment is. A president already tied to an attempted overthrow of the government, already impeached twice, already accused of pressuring state officials to find votes, and now we are right back here with lawmakers saying, we cannot let this continue. That is not supposed to happen in a stable democracy. That happens when the people inside the system believe the system itself is in danger.
And honestly, what makes this even more surreal is that Trump and his allies are pretending this is just another fake controversy. Like it's the same thing as a bad headline or an inconvenient poll. It's not. You don't invoke impeachment in the 25th Amendment because of vibes. You do it because the behavior has crossed into territory that the Constitution was specifically designed to stop. Make no mistake, this is not about manners. This is not about decorum. This is not about hurt feelings. This is about whether there are any real limits left on presidential power. Because every time Trump smashes through a guardrail and survives, the next one becomes easier to destroy. And now the question in Washington is no longer did he go too far? The question is the system still capable of stopping him at all? Because what's happening right now is a direct collision between a man who believes the rules don't apply to him and a constitution that was built precisely for moments like this. And one of them is about to break. And that brings us to the part they really don't want you to focus on. What exactly triggered this sudden surge in removal demands and how deep the evidence actually goes? Here's the reality that Trump and his allies don't want you to see. These removal demands didn't fall out of the sky. They didn't just magically appear because Democrats woke up cranky one morning. They were triggered by formal impeachment filings, actual documents entered into the congressional record, accusing Trump of a sweeping, coordinated abuse of power that touches almost every corner of the federal government. Not one allegation, not two, 7 separate articles of impeachment. Let that sink in. 7. That is not symbolic outrage. That is a comprehensive indictment of an entire presidency.
And this is where the gaslighting begins. Because Trump's defenders want you to believe this is just another witch hunt. But the reality, the boring, documented, in black and white reality is that these articles are tied to specific conduct, specific powers, and specific constitutional violations. Start with obstruction of justice. This isn't some abstract concept. This is about a president using the power of his office to interfere with investigations into his own conduct, attacking prosecutors, intimidating witnesses, pressuring agencies, twisting the Justice Department into a personal legal shield. That is not a policy disagreement. That is a cover-up. And it's the exact same behavior that brought down Nixon. Different decade, same playbook. Then you get to Congress's power over spending. The Constitution is crystal clear here. Congress controls the purse. Period. Trump does not get to override that because he doesn't like how the money was appropriated. And yet repeatedly, Trump has frozen funds that Congress legally approved, ignored court orders demanding those funds be released, just sat on the money as if the legislative branch were merely advisory. That's not negotiation. That's a power grab. And honestly, this is where the hypocrisy becomes comical. Republicans suddenly pretend to care about executive restraint when it suits them. But when Trump unilaterally withholds congressionally approved funds, they're silent. Because for them, it's not about principle, it's about protecting the man. Next, abuse of trade powers. Trump has built his economic identity around tariffs, slapping them on, boasting about them, bragging about them like they're personal trophies. But here's the inconvenient truth. Traded authority belongs to Congress. Emergency powers were never meant to be used as a shortcut around the legislature for personal economic experiments. And yet Trump has treated them exactly that way, weaponizing tariffs without meaningful congressional authorization, driving up consumer prices, and destabilizing markets on a whim. That's not strength. That's unilateral economic roulette.
Then we get to First Amendment retaliation. This part should chill everyone, regardless of party. The impeachment filings accuse Trump of using government power to punish speech he doesn't like, threatening media outlets, going after law firms, targeting critics through regulatory pressure. That is not tough talk. That is state retaliation against dissent. That is the behavior of autocrats, not presidents of constitutional republics. But wait, it gets worse. There's also the creation of unlawful offices, and this one doesn't get enough attention because it sounds dry, but it is deeply dangerous. Congress creates agencies. Congress funds agencies. That's the separation of powers. Trump, according to these filings, has created parallel power structures that answer directly to him, sidestepping congressional oversight entirely. That is how shadow governments form. That is how accountability disappears. Then comes bribery and corruption, the part Trump has spent years trying to normalize. Foreign governments booking his hotels, businesses positioning payments in ways that benefit his personal enterprises, the presidency functioning as a global tip jar. The Constitution explicitly lists bribery as an impeachable offense for a reason. This isn't gray. This isn't debatable. This is the founders screaming across 250 years of history, this is the thing we warned you about. And finally, the article that ties everything together, tyranny, not as a vibe, not as a metaphor, as a documented pattern, defying courts, attacking judges, threatening political opponents, purging inspectors general, weaponizing the executive branch against enemies, a presidency structured not around democratic governance, but around personal power. And here's the part that absolutely detonates the "this is just politics" narrative. These charges didn't emerge in a vacuum. They are layered on top of years of documented conduct, from the Ukraine shakedown to the January 6th incitement to the Georgia Find Me Votes call. This is not one bad decision. This is a sustained methodology.
Now, let's talk about the war powers angle for a second, because this one is even more explosive. The Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. The president does not get to unilaterally act as a king on matters of life and death. And yet Trump has repeatedly ordered military actions without proper authorization, treating global conflict like a personal command button. That's not just unconstitutional, that's reckless. That's how wars start without public consent. So when lawmakers are now openly talking about removal, this is what they're talking about. Not feelings, not tone, receipts. And this is also why Trump's defense is so thin. Notice what he never does. He never refutes the conduct. He never explains the constitutional authority. He just screams witch hunt, attacks motives, and floods the zone with noise. Because he can't win on substance. He can only survive on confusion. And honestly, the most telling part of all of this is how quickly Republicans pivot to process arguments. Is this constitutional? Is this the right timing? Is this politically smart? They avoid the central question at all costs. Did the president abuse his power? Because if they admit that answer is yes, everything else collapses. And that brings us to the real problem. Because once you normalize the president ignoring Congress, ignoring courts, retaliating against speech, monetizing the office, and acting unilaterally on war powers, you no longer have a constitutional executive. You have an elected strongman. And now, finally, Congress is being forced to confront the monster it spent years empowering. But none of this happened by accident. This didn't suddenly explode out of nowhere. This removal crisis is the final stage of a pattern that has been years in the making. And that brings us to the part they really don't want you to connect.
Make no mistake, what you are watching right now did not begin this year. It didn't begin with this impeachment filing. It didn't begin with these resignation demands. This is the inevitable collision that comes after nearly a decade of systematic norm demolition. What's happening now is not an overreaction to one scandal. It is the delayed consequence of letting a pattern metastasize. Because if you trace Trump's behavior from the very start, the through line is unmistakable. Attack the institutions that can restrain you, flood the zone with chaos, and dare the system to stop you. Over and over and over again. It started with the press, enemy of the people. Not criticism, not debate, delegitimization. Because if the public stops trusting information, power becomes uncheckable. Then it was the courts. Judges who ruled against him weren't just wrong, they were Obama judges, Mexican judges, corrupt judges. The goal wasn't to win legal arguments. The goal was to poison the authority of the referee. Then it was the law enforcement. He demanded loyalty oaths from the FBI director, fired the one who wouldn't give it, interfered with investigations into his own conduct, publicly signaled to witnesses, issued implicit threats, used pardons as retroactive reward mechanisms for silence. This isn't chaos. This is design. And every single time, the same script played out. Trump would do something that would have obliterated any previous presidency. Republicans would briefly act concerned, then they'd fall in line, then the base would be told it was all fake, then the media cycle would move on. Rinse, repeat, until the abnormal became normalized. The Ukraine shakedown didn't result in consequences. The Mueller obstruction didn't result in consequences. The emoluments violations didn't result in consequences. So Trump learned the lesson the system taught him. There is no real penalty for escalation. Which brings us to January 6th.
Because January 6th was not a fluke. It was not a spontaneous eruption of chaos. It was the logical endpoint of years of telling people the system is rigged, the courts are illegitimate, the press is lying, the elections are fake, and only one man tells the truth. You cannot spend years saturating the public with that message and then act surprised when some of them act on it. And here's the part they still don't want to grapple with. Trump did not accidentally incite January 6th. He constructed the conditions for it. He summoned the crowd. He fed them the lie. He aimed them at the Capitol. And when it unfolded, he waited and waited and waited because the chaos was the point. And yet, even after all of that, even after law enforcement officers were beaten, even after lawmakers were forced to flee, even after the entire world watched American democracy stagger on live television, the system still didn't impose a final consequence. He was impeached. Again. He was acquitted. Again. Which sent a message. A dangerous message. A message not just to Trump, but to every future authoritarian. You can push the system to the brink, and it will still hesitate to stop you. After January 6th, most people assumed the book was closed. That's it. He's done. But Trump didn't retreat. He regrouped. He tested again. He escalated again. Pressure on state officials, purges inside the party, loyalty tests, primary threats, retaliation as governance, and finally, the consolidation, transforming the Republican Party into an enforcement mechanism for personal power. This is the pattern. Break norms, force compliance, punish dissent, reward loyalty. Repeat. And now, that pattern has migrated fully into governance again. Retaliation via regulation, threats via executive power, economic coercion via tariffs, law enforcement as political weapon, war powers as personal prerogative. And at every stage, Republicans are placed in the same position, either defend the indefensible or become the next target.
Which is why the silence from many of them right now is not neutrality. It is fear. Fear of the base, fear of retaliation, fear of being on the wrong side of the strong man. And this is where the removal clock becomes something more than a headline. Because what Congress is reacting to now is not just a single episode of misconduct. They are reacting to the realization that this entire presidency is structured around the erosion of democratic constraint. That erosion didn't happen all at once. It happened one norm at a time. One exception at a time. One, this isn't a big deal at a time. Until suddenly, the exception becomes the rule, and the rule becomes optional. And here's the most brutal truth of all. Trump could not have done this alone. He required enablers. He required silence. He required cowardice.
He required a party that shows power over principle at every critical fork in the road. And now those choices have come due. You don't wake up one day to a constitutional crisis. You walk into it slowly until suddenly the exit is gone. Which is why what's happening right now is not just about Trump. It is about the people who refused to stop him when stopping him was politically inconvenient. Because the price of delay is always paid in crisis. And now we are in the crisis phase. And that brings us to the most dangerous question of all. Not what Trump has already done, but what happens if nothing finally stops him now? Because this is the moment where history tilts. Make no mistake, if this moment passes without real consequence, what comes next will not be a return to normal. It will be an acceleration. Because power that is tested and not restrained does not retreat, it expands. That is the lesson of history, and it is the lesson Trump has already internalized.
Congress blinks again. If this removal push collapses under the weight of cowardice, political calculation, or raw fear of the base, the signal it sends will be unmistakable. There is no behavior so extreme that it triggers a definitive stop. The rule of law becomes a suggestion. The Constitution becomes a prop. And future presidents will not learn restraint. They will learn how far they can go. This is not hyperbole. This is how democracies erode. Not with one dramatic overthrow, but with repeated failures to enforce limits until the idea of limits itself becomes laughable. Because think about what unchecked actually means in practice. It means a president who already treats the Justice Department like a shield now knows he can openly use it as a weapon. It means a president who already retaliates against critics now knows he can do it brazenly. It means war power is exercised without fear of congressional retaliation. It means economic coercion through tariffs and spending freezes without accountability. It means the presidency transformed into an instrument of permanent political retaliation. And once that door is open, it doesn't close with Trump. It becomes a template. You think future presidents will look at this moment and say, wow, better be careful? Or do you think they'll say, so this is how far we can go? Because that's the end game here. That's what's actually being decided right now. Not Trump's fate alone, but the operational definition of presidential power going forward. And this is why the argument that removal will fail anyway, so why bother, completely misses the point. Accountability is not just about success. It is about establishing a line. It is about forcing every single institution to declare where it stands when the rules are tested. Silence is not neutrality at a moment like this. Silence is permission. And here's the terrifying part. Trump is already operating as if that permission has been granted.
You see it in the language, the certainty, the brazenness, the assumption that consequences are a thing that happens to other people. He no longer governs like someone worried about legal boundaries. He governs like someone who believes survival alone proved legitimacy. That is how elected leaders slide into permanent power, by turning endurance into proof of righteousness. And when you combine that with a political movement that now treats defeat as fraud, law as persecution, and institutions as enemies, you get a combustible mix. Because once a leader convinces his base that only he is legitimate, every check on his power becomes, by definition, illegitimate. Courts become rigged, elections become stolen, Congress becomes corrupt, oversight becomes witch hunts. And what's left after all of that is not democracy. It's personal rule with a cheering section. This is why the language being used by lawmakers right now is so stark. You don't invoke the 25th Amendment lightly. You don't openly discuss removal lightly. You don't hold press conferences demanding resignation lightly. Those are the kinds of tools that are supposed to sit on the constitutional shelf forever, used only in emergencies. And the fact that they are now being spoken aloud tells you exactly how severe this moment is behind the scenes. And here's the uncomfortable truth that a lot of people don't want to confront. Even if Trump survives this effort politically, the damage doesn't vanish. It compounds. Because every failed attempt to impose its limits becomes evidence that the system can't impose them. And once that belief sets in at the top of the power structure, law enforcement stops being neutral, watchdogs stop being effective, and institutions stop being independent. They become optional. This is how authoritarian systems build themselves inside legal frameworks, not by abolishing constitutions, but by hollowing them out while keeping the shell intact.
And if you think that can't happen here, understand something. Every country where it did happen once believed the exact same thing. They believed their courts were strong enough. They believed their press was free enough. They believed their institutions were independent enough. They believed their people would stop it in time. Until one day they looked around and realized the guarding mechanisms had been quietly disarmed years earlier. And that is why this removal push, regardless of its outcome, matters more than almost any other moment in recent American history, because it forces the system to answer a question it has been deferring for nearly a decade. Are the rules real, or are they cosmetic? Do presidents answer to the law, or does the law answer to presidents? Does the Constitution restrain power, or does power reinterpret the Constitution? Those are not academic questions anymore. They are operational questions, and they're being asked in real time. And for the public, here is the most important piece of all. This is not a spectator event. The reason authoritarianism survives is not because elites impose it alone. It survives because enough people are persuaded to look away, to numb out, to say it's all just politics, to disengage when engagement becomes exhausting. That is how erosion becomes invisible. If you care about whether your vote matters in the future, whether law enforcement remains independent, whether courts remain something other than political theater, this is the moment to pay attention. Not when it's over, not when history books summarize it in 2 neat paragraphs. Now. Because what happens next will tell every future president exactly how the story ends when they decide to test the boundaries. And the most dangerous precedent isn't that a president abuses power, it's that the system proves it cannot stop him.
So yes, the removal clock is ticking, and not just for Trump. It is ticking for the credibility of the constitutional order itself. Whether it stops him or not will define whether the next person even bothers to pretend to follow the rules. And that is the line we are standing on right now. This is the moment history will come back to. This fork in the road is what future generations will study and ask one simple question about. Did the system finally hold, or did it fold again? Because if this ends with more excuses, more delay, more now isn't the right time, then the message to every future strongman is crystal clear. Push hard enough and the rules evaporate. This isn't about Trump anymore. It's about whether the law still has teeth in America. Watch closely, because what happens next doesn't just decide this presidency. It decides what the presidency becomes.